thank you, David. Why the form of Christ's death matters. And then we'll think through chapter 3, where she's talking about the justice or the crucifixion in relation to justice and how we should think about this form of death as God's vision of justice or God's carrying out justice, and how those are related in strange ways. And then I've got some questions, but I'd also love to hear what everybody's thinking in the room. Before we go on, any questions or comments or concerns for that plan? Okay. Well, let's take a look at last week's takeaways. I'll always try and include some of the big picture takeaways at the end of this handout, and I'll throw that on the next week's handout for the sake of our review. So from the introduction, chapter 1, the main thing that we talked about last week is the basic goal of the book, which is just Fleming Rutledge trying to help us figure out what it is that actually happens on the cross. There's a whole lot of historical data to say that there was a first century Jewish man named Jesus who was killed by the Roman state by way of execution. We know that much. You don't have to believe in a God to see that much. There's a lot of historical data. And yet the Christian theological tradition thinks that there's more happening in that event than just a man being put to death. It is a man being put to death. It will also claim that this is somehow salvific. It's revelatory of who God is. It's revelatory of God's intended interventions in history. And we also believe that the man does not stay dead and resurrects later, and thereby inaugurates a kind of new phase of history. So there's a lot going on in how we narrate this particular death. The whole point of theology is for us to be able to say, what is it that we think happened here? What is it that we think happened? Or how should we think about what happens on the cross? This book by Fleming Rutledge, who's a big deal, prominent Episcopal priest, fantastic preacher and thinker and leader of the church for a few decades now. It's a confessional and pastoral text, by which it just means this is not an objective kind of distanced thing. This is a priest trying to work it out from a priest's perspective. And she has pastoral concerns in mind. She's thinking about people like us who are here trying to figure it out on a Sunday morning. She wants to move the crucifixion back to the center of Christian and Episcopal theology and worship. There's been trends over the last 30-ish years in theology to prioritize other topics as the heart of Christian theology. And things like the incarnation, things like the resurrection, things like creation, all of which is fine and good, from the religion say. But those things only find their real meaning when they're read through the prism of the crucifixion. And so she's going to try and help us get over some of the squeamishness that she thinks people have with the crucifixion, the nervousness of its implications, and move that back to the center. All in all, she's going to argue that in order to properly perceive the nature of the cross, we have to reckon with its godlessness and its expression of justice and the way that it definitively overthrows sin. We're going to talk about two of those three points today. Its godlessness. What does it mean for God to vacate the premises of an event? How is that even possible? Is it possible? And what does it mean? How can a godless event be God's execution of justice? And then we'll briefly touch on the third one, which is that the cross becomes the way that God is going to, in like a cosmic level, address sin and injustice once and for all. And we have to understand all three of those things in order to actually understand what's happening on the cross, Rutledge says. We noted last week about how the cross is sort of like the climax of the biblical text. All of the gospel narratives are very much heading towards the same story told from different perspectives. Paul's constantly referring to it. Rutledge thinks a lot of the Hebrew Bible and Old Testament is anticipating, it's like setting the stage for these things as well. So it's very much the basis or the foundation out of which we should read biblical narratives. And the point E here, the takeaways, is really going to be the focus of chapter 2 that we'll see in a second, that God's purposes are revealed in the mode of Jesus's death, or the way that Jesus is killed, as much as the fact that Jesus is the Messiah. Like, it's not enough that Jesus just dies. There's something going on with the particular kind of death that we'll talk about. So that's what we did last week. That's intro in chapter 1. What is it that we're trying to do? Why are we so fascinated by or interested in the crucifixion? What's Rutledge's basic goal? Questions or thoughts about any of that? Whether it's something that dawned on you throughout the week or something that's just hidden, you know.
I'm curious how much of the crucifixion / resurrection was prophesied, maybe talked about in the Old Testament, and did we kind of orchestrate the actual happening based on that, or?
That's a great question.
Repeat.
Yeah, it's a great question. So what can we remind me of your name? Ed. Ed's asking, I'm gonna repeat questions too, so Zoomers can hear us. Ed's asking how much of the crucifixion and resurrection is prophesied about in the Old Testament, in a way that, is there a possibility that we sort of orchestrate this thing to fulfill what we said was gonna happen? What's the continuity between the two clusters of texts? It's a great question, and to be frank, Ed, I don't know. I know that there's elements of the prophecy in there, like there's plenty of stuff about it in Isaiah, some in Job of resurrection. But I don't know the Hebrew Bible well enough to point to, here's all of the really rich language that precedes it. I'm sure that this is a point where we're just going to miss Job, because Job would rattle off the 100 places where it's referenced, right? I cannot. But I am interested in the question of, are you orchestrating this in a way that just fulfills it? And I think my initial reaction is that would be pretty tough to pull off, given how massively involved, how many different parties there are, and the long-term scheming and the concerns that were given from the various parties, given Pilate's hesitancies. None of it comes across to me, at least in the New Testament texts, as some pulling strings, as much as this big picture historic force marching forward. And then maybe the other point would be just how many times the disciples are hesitant or confused about the whole death thing. Jesus says a bunch of times, I am going to go die, right? This is not going to be carried out in the way that you anticipated. And there's a kind of a fits and shock that they hear in that the first few times before they really reckon with it, which would seem more of their being caught up in the historic march rather than facilitating it. It's a good question. Any other ones? Okay, cool. And if you're comfortable with it, I'm plenty comfortable telling you I have no idea. So ask the question, and if we can get there with some information, great. And if not, then maybe we can pass it on to somebody else. All right, so let's look at the scandalon chapter. This is chapter 2. The scandalon, I think, is just a Greek word for scandal, but theologians love using different languages for some reason. Rutledge says it takes a good deal of information and imagination to wrap our minds around the gruesome details of the crucifixion. And it matters that we do so. But I want to say this on the front end. I don't read this chapter as a kind of a theological support or something like Mel Gibson's The Passion. There's no fetishizing or obsession over an emotional reaction to the details of the suffering. Something different. Rutledge isn't trying to get you to face the horror in a particular way and feel unsettled, and then let the emotional reaction do something for you spiritually, which I think is sort of some of the intended purposes of a movie like The Passion. Relish is going to do something different, where she says we really have to consider and ponder why this kind of death, and let's trace out the implications of it to see how the crucifixion is working, what's actually going on here. But we have to press into the information, and we have to do the imagining in order to properly conceive of the scandal. And this is why she draws a good bit on some pretty prominent theologians from the 21st century in this chapter. There's a German theologian named Jürgen Moltmann, who has an important book called The Crucified God. And he makes a good bit, he spends a good bit of time trying to rethink in the popular imagery of the cross or the crucifixion. He says it's like somewhat understandable that the crucifix becomes so central to Christian imagery and worship, but over the history, we've lost a lot of the context because of that. When he says the contemporary analogy would be the electric chair, that the cross is a form of state-sanctioned death. Like, this is how the Roman Empire puts thieves to death. It's strategically brutal. It's strategically embarrassing. This is not like a sweet moment. This is the full force of like a government power bearing down on an individual, right? So, it's a little uncomfortable to think about it in those terms, but I think that's some of what Moltmann thinks is appropriate about it. That we need to remove some of the sugar glaze of our understanding of the crucifixion, because this is the state putting a man to death, and that event is the one that we're going to claim as salvific for us. Another example that she'll point to is James Cohen, who just passed away in the last couple of years. Very prominent and important Black liberation theologian. And his last book, maybe second to last, it's a similar kind of rereading of the crucifixion, but it's called The Crossing of the Lynching Tree. And he's positioning the crucifixion in terms of Jesus' social position up against the Roman Empire being put to death in this way. For us, it's analogous to a Black lynching in the American Southeast, right? Uncomfortable, but an important rereading, I think, because there's a certain, and I think both of those analogies will point to some of the godlessness that Rutledge wants to think about. This is a brutal kind of intentional, abject death, and it's important for us to name attributes. The primary thesis of the chapter is that God's purposes are revealed in the way that Jesus dies, as much as they are in the fact that Jesus is the Messiah that dies. It matters that Jesus is the Messiah. It matters that Jesus is fully God, fully human, one person. However, we're going to work that out conceptually. It matters that it's that person that's dying. It also matters that it's that person dying in this way, in this electric chair, state-sanctioned, horrifying death way. You got to have both. It would not be enough for me to have been killed that way. That's not salvific. We know that the Romans execute a lot of people by crucifixion. There's only one of them that we're claiming is salvific. But it does matter that Jesus didn't die of a heart attack in his bed. It matters that he's put to death in this way. She thinks that the cross is the climax of the story that's running throughout the Bible. And this isn't even the climax of the story of, like, we've known for a long time that God was going to take on flesh and upset a lot of people and be killed by the state. She's taking she's zooming out and taking a bigger perspective to say there's a big narrative of good and evil and sin and God's vision for justice that's been brewing all throughout the scripture, and it comes to a climax in this death. So the crucifixion becomes a story of a God who is at work to make right a broken world and an unjust world of sin on behalf of the defenseless. That is, to go back to Ed's point earlier, we do know there's a ton of that running through the Hebrew Bible. God consistently identifying with the poor and the defenseless. God consistently hearing the cries of the Hebrews and brutal system of slavery in Egypt. Consistent cries in the Psalms of being trampled, but God being faithful and understanding. Please, right? Please remember me. Please don't forget us. Please do carry out your justice in the way you promised. So we have a couple of these things that we're given in the Hebrew Bible of God is a good and just, capable God. We have plenty of experiences of sin, or of a sinful world where there's suffering, there's oppression. We've got plenty of elements of the story where God is consistently choosing to identify with the people on the bottom and the promise of justice. And Fleming Rutledge says all of this comes to a climax in the crucifixion. It's when the justice is actually carried out in the most definitive way. And it's the crucifixion. This is going to be important too, because at least for some of us, this might be a different way of thinking about the crucifixion. Is not just a way for God to address your individual sin, so as to rectify your individual relationship with God. It is that, but it's that because it's part of a larger historic address. This is about God fixing evil. This is about God fixing oppression and injustice. This is about God saying that there is not going to be anything that will stand in my way of doing things. And part and parcel of that is your own individual participation in the sin that's addressed. But we'll get to that a little more in, I think, chapter 5 or 6. So the confession of Christ's crucifixion, I'm at the bottom of the first page now. The confession of Christ's crucifixion is a confession of God's total entrance into the shame and the violence of human affairs. It is a total entrance. Some of the early church fathers, I think it's one of the Cappadocians, so 3rd-ish century important theologian named Gregory of Nyssa has this quip where he says, the unassumed is the unhealed. The unassumed is the unhealed. Which is to say, whatever aspect of your experience that Jesus does not take on or have some share in during his time in the world is an aspect of your experience that Jesus could not have redeemed in the crucifixion and resurrection. If it's human in name only, then there's a lot of like deeply human pain that doesn't really get fixed, right? If it's human without any doubts or the possibility of screwing it up, then not everything's really being addressed. So for these historic thinkers and for Rutledge, God has to go all the way in. There's no like deep, dark chasm of human nature or being that Jesus doesn't take on to himself. It's the whole kit and caboodle, right? Which means that we're now able to say that like your worst moments of shame, your deepest pains, like the stuff that hasn't been resolved and probably won't be resolved, the stuff that you're angriest about, you're most confused about, all of that, Jesus is now deeply, deeply familiar with. And that's some of why we want to stress the scandal here, that God goes all the way in Jesus. And that it is a brutal, brutal death as a way of like ensuring that all of our stuff is wrapped up with Jesus's experience. On page 84, I'm going to the top of page 2. This is a helpful quote, I think. She says, when we say that Jesus took upon himself the sin of the world, It means quite specifically that he suffered the shame and the degradation that human beings have inflicted on one another, and that he, above all others, had done nothing to merit. It's another important set of tensions that she's going to affirm. Jesus doesn't participate in these things in a way that he's like becomes an active member of the dynamic. He's not passing the shame or the degradation on to other people, but he's involved in a way where he receives all of it. He's not passing it on, but he receives it. He doesn't deserve it, but he's intimately familiar with it, especially on the cross. But she says on 102, so 20-ish pages later, that no other mode of execution would have been commensurate with the extremity of humanity's condition under sin. I think this is one of the bolder claims of the chapters, or of this chapter, I should say. That I don't know if I'm actually persuaded by this. I don't know that it really matters to you or not, but I want to hear if you are. She's saying that there's no other way of death. Like it really does have to be crucifixion. The only way that it can be salvific is if it's crucifixion on the cross by the Roman state. Because any other kind of death, she thinks, would not give us this like dramatic picture of God's total entry into the shame. This is the only way that God can enter into the depths of our godlessness, and God does that in order to address both injustice as an operative power and our individual sins. For reasons we'll talk about in about 10 minutes, Fleming Rutledge is going to talk about injustice and death and sin as like big active powers that when we sin, we're participating in. It's almost like we're hooking onto it and drawing some energy from it to feed or to enable our sinful tendencies. So that if I lie to you, it's not just a thing that bubbles up within me in isolation. My lying to you is actually a kind of a participation in this looming evil power of injustice out there. And you loop into that when you lie to me, I loop into it when I lie to you. And we're both very much responsible for our deception, but we're also participating in something larger about like the nature of human being and injustice in the world. So the cross will address both my complicity with that, as well as the power itself. And she's drawing a lot of this stuff from Paul in the New Testament. Paul uses the language of principalities and powers. What in the world does that mean? She's going to say principalities and powers is like this big picture, almost like a life force of injustice and sin. And the cross has to reckon with both of those things. So it matters that Christ suffered in the most humiliating way, the crucifixion, because the mode of death is the most fitting means through which Christ could address the absurdities of our conditions under sin. That's why she thinks it has to be the cross. It's the most absurd way, and it's therefore the best avenue for Jesus to address our individual sins and the power of sin that God is going to overcome in the crucifixion. And then at the end of the chapter, we get a little overview of two ideas that she's going to spend some significant time fleshing out later. One is sin as a power, which is the thing I was just trying to describe to you. And two is the apocalyptic struggle that she wants to speak about. And we'll spell that out in the Cross and Justice chapter in a second. Okay, so I would love to hear what you think about this. So my questions are just one, do you have any questions that you need clarification on something? Two would be, what do you make of the idea that it has to be crucifixion? Do you buy it, do you not buy it? And then three, how does the idea of sin as power strike you? Do you identify with that? Is that confusing or weird? Or what do you think? And Zoomers, feel free to chat in if you need to.
I have kind of a question. I read bits and pieces, I haven't read it all.
Understandable.
Well, part of what I understood it saying was part of it happening this way was because it was all done within the law, it was all done publicly. And I think part of that translates to me is so many people would have related to what was happening at the time. It wouldn't be like now that if you did some type of execution that nobody in this room would be able to relate to.
Yeah, that's helpful. So Carol's saying, it's Carol, right? Carol's saying, for the sake of my online friends, that part of what Rutledge is saying is that it has to be crucifixion because there's a totally legal avenue here. There's a reference for familiarity. It's public in a way that people would have totally understood. It's par for the course of the vision of justice that Rome is capable of delivering. It's not sort of outside of normalcy in that sense. It's all built into the way that we did things, the way we do things. Okay, I'm gonna try and read Greg's question and comment. So Greg Miller says, hey Greg, so who died on the cross? For me, it's always had to be a man. The Messiah represents us and that we must accept the suffering we take on and the path that we must follow to Jesus. To do that, we must see ourselves in the crucifixion or in the execution. Okay, I think that's really helpful, Greg. And I think for Rutledge, it definitely does have to be a man, and it definitely has to be a unique man, right? This isn't just God in the costume of human flesh in the crucifixion. It's the fullness of you and me and your lived experience. And there's another nature there, which is divine. And I do think there is some, it'd be interesting to reflect, if we had more time, it'd be interesting to reflect a little more on what is given to you and seeing yourself there. Because I do think that's a common spiritual practice. But you're right, it has to be fully human and fully divine, all in one.
Shannon also had a comment.
And I was on St. Paul's.
No,
Oh, I see. I do think the worst kind of death in time because okay, yeah. So Shannon's saying, for the historical point, it makes some sense that it had to be the crucifixion because historically speaking, that was definitely the worst that was available. So it's the available path at the time in the worst way. And two, we can sort of understand that as a go-to in light of the contemporary analogies. I think that's helpful. Anybody else? Any points that need to be clarified? Any thoughts on has to be the crucifixion or sin as a power? What do y'all think about sin as a power? Okay, well, it's okay if you don't have thoughts yet because you're going to hear about it for 6 more weeks. Yeah. Yeah, happy to. I'm going to peek here and see if it comes up anymore in the 3rd chapter. Okay, no, I don't think it does. When she's talking about sin as a power, what I think she's meaning is that it is a force or an agency outside of you. It is not just a thing that you do from time to time, but there is a kind of cosmic battle that has been going on between God's goodness and intended goodness for creation and the condition of sin that is kicked off in the Garden of Eden. And when we sin, we're participating in something larger, like a force outside of us that is looming and around. And we're on the hook for it, right? It's something that I am consenting to, but it's something that is beyond just me as well. So at the very least, this gives us the idea that sin is larger than just the bad things we do. We can can see other effects of sin. And we can see other effects of sin. I actually don't know if I can substantiate that. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Pardon the comparison, but it sounds a lot like Ghostbusters in New York City, has all the bad vibes, everybody boiling up, and this thing is now going to attack them, and they reverse that by going, hey, we can get along together better.
Totally.
And they solve the situation.
No, I love, no forgiveness needs to be given for the analogy. There is something of that, and that it's energy. So I almost think some of Star Wars do. There is a force of goodness, there's a force of evil that's out there that we can channel and participate in that also exceeds me. So when you sin, when I sin, we're participating in a larger thing, perhaps growing it, perhaps shaping it and directing it. But it's more than just each of the individual actions. It's all of the actions that are kind of effects from this larger injustice, sense of sin. Does that help build it out at all?
For sure, thank you.
Okay, yeah, you're welcome. David,
Shannon,
like systematic racism or greed? Yeah, Shannon, that's exactly right. Systematic racism is a good example. Racism can't just be boiled down to individual prejudice, right? Individual prejudice is a part of it, but to talk systematically about racism is to say that we have a whole history and structures that are actively carrying out these kinds of priorities, these kinds of missions. So it's something outside of an individual, but it's certainly something an individual participates in. That's a great analogy too.
and then Kate and Jeff right above that.
Okay, Kate and Jeff, I actually am not familiar with that history. The question is Jesus the first to acknowledge the connection of, is it connection or correction?
Connection.
Yeah, the act of social execution and therefore for the connection with God, sin and forgiveness. Kate and Jeff, it's a good question. I don't think I know how to answer it. I think it's a fair point to ask if Jesus is the first to acknowledge it and if we need him to be or not. But I don't think I'm familiar enough with the history to be able to give a meaningful reflection there, but I'd love to hear more about it next time our paths cross. Maybe while we move on to the next chapter, could you all spell out a little more of what you mean in the chat? Would you be willing to do that? Okay, cool. All right, let's go on. We've got about 10 minutes left before we pause for prayer. Oh no, we're good. That clock is fast. So let's go on to the chapter on cross and justice. In this third chapter, Fleming Rutledge is going to contend that the cross and its gruesome God-forsakenness, all of that stuff that we just talked about, like the abjection of that death, it actually weirdly has to be understood in terms of God's justice. So the justice depends on the total shame and forsakenness of the death. God's justice, as she shows by tracing out major themes in the Old and the New Testament alike, is, quote, specific in particular, showing that God is attentive to the material demands of human needs. This is a theme that she thinks is running, and she does a good job going throughout, and all throughout the chapter of just noting the myriad places scripturally when this comes up. In the Old and the New Testaments alike, it is specific in particular, and that shows that God is attentive to the material demands of the human need, which is good news, I believe, and that God, as a transcendent being, is not so far removed from us that there is a distance or an unfamiliarity with the particularities of your experience, which is to say that there's no scale of pettiness of things that you would bring to God. God is attentive to your situation and all of its particularities. That is part of the claim of justice for Rutledge. And this matters, she says, because of the pervasive power of sin. And whenever she's going to use sin as a capital S sin, she's talking about sin like the total cosmic power way. She says, in our world, something is terribly wrong and cries out to be put right. Is there a question?
Not so much a question, just like, that's really interesting to me in that, we just talked about sin, right? Because it feels to me like we sort of do the opposite of these two things. Like we think of God as being very big and not really concerned with travel, like individual sort of day-to-day. Whereas a lot of times when we think about sin, we think about lying and stealing and adultery and not about systemic racism and exploitation of people in the earth, you know, and so like, really like how she's kind of flipping those and helping us think about that a little bit different, because when you think about it that way, I'm a lot more comfortable talking about all of us as sinners, right?
Right. No, I think that's right. That's helpful. So it's just noting, what was your name?
Sarah.
Sarah, if I heard correctly, is just noting the way that Relish is flipping some of this, where we're talking about sin as these larger forces outside of us that we participate in. And that's opposite of what we typically do. One of the payoffs being it also makes our individual particularities more conversational. We can talk about them more. And there's a certain comfort that comes with, okay, maybe we don't have to jettison the sin language altogether. That's good. So she's referring to capital S sin as that large historic force of sin that we participate in and draw from. She'll capitalize that throughout, so I'll keep capitalizing it just to remind us how like the scale of the address for Rutledge. And she's pointing to like the basic sense of injustice that we will hear about or experience or feel the need to be addressed. It's the basic sense that things are not great and they could be better. That is a lot of the place from which we need to be thinking about God's justice in the crucifixion. She draws a ton in this chapter on Nelson Mandela's truth and reconciliation work in order to argue that forgiveness cannot be detached from justice. In order to make any meaningful sense of forgiveness, there has to be a sense of justice as well. So forgiveness, she says, is not actually the essence of Christianity. And our contemporary infatuations with God's love and forgiveness need to be corrected with a renewed emphasis of righteousness in order to demonstrate that there's no distinction between God's love, justice, and righteousness. We have made Christianity about like a kind of an exchange wherein my sin can be forgiven so that everything can be fine between me and God. There's no longer a breakdown or a barrier. And Rutledge says that is a misunderstanding because you're overlooking why there was a barrier to begin with. Where does the injustice come from? And what is God doing in order to make things right again? It's not just about the forgiveness of my sins. And there's no way to actually make sense of mine and your sins being forgiven until we talk about God's intervening and just actions to set things right again. Does that make sense? She says we try and sliver these off like slices of a pie, as though you can just have a slice of forgiveness and not have to do any of the slice of justice or mercy or love. But all of the, you mix up all of the filling ingredients ahead of time. So everything is all in all of the other slices, right? You can't just isolate it and have one. On page 129, she says that the humor and exuberance of a freedom fighter like Desmond Tutu are evoked, fueled, and sustained by the conviction that God is on the side of those who are defenseless and voiceless, who have no powerful friends, who are abused and oppressed by the system. It makes some sense that she's looking at Nelson Mandela in the wake of apartheid, South Africa. It's a good way for her to talk about capital S sin as like historic forces and systems and individuals carrying out brutal atrocities like genocide fueled by animus. And it's a contemporary example to say that these things are ongoing, But it's also a good way for her to look at Mandela's response in the Truth and Reconciliation conversations, and to say that in order for forgiveness to happen, we have to get clear on the injustice. And we have to get clear on what justice looks like after this. You have to have all of that stuff at once. So already here we can see that Rutledge is preparing the way for her treatment of Anselm in that bridge chapter, particularly in his prioritization of proportionate justice. This is a big idea for Anselm that Rutledge will get a lot of traction with, that the justice and the injustice and the correction have to be proportional. There has to be a match of kinds. And to take all of that interplay seriously, she thinks, it requires that you go back to the cross. These are tensions and ideas and dynamics that you can't just get from the incarnation, from the resurrection, from creation. All of this stuff is really held together, like she's been saying, in the crucifixion. So she also is going to insist that God's rectification of the world, the way that God fixes the problems or addresses the injustice, it's both forgiveness and it's judgment all at once. God's wrath then is not some emotion that inconsistently flares up, but it's actually, and this is a quote, God's absolute enmity against all wrong and is coming to set matters right. So the wrath is not like a losing of a temper. I'm finally going to dump out all of my anger. It is justice and intervention and righteous anger all at once. And it is going to be delivered against the capital S, sin as power, in a way that Rutledge thinks it's actually going to be defeated in the crucifixion. So that capital S, sin as power, is not the same after the resurrection as it was before. And we'll get to next week some of how and why that impacts where we're at in this point in history. But in the crucifixion, God is going to, because of who Jesus is and because of the type of death, we can read that story of that death as God's actual address to capital S sin and all of the lowercase sins that you and I do and carry out, and all of the pain that we have and feel and carry with us. It's downstream from capital S sin. And then she's going to talk a little bit about this, the sense of apocalypse, which I think is a helpful way to clarify some of this power stuff of the capital S sin is power. So at the simplest level, and there's a big trend in the last 20 years to talk about the New Testament in terms of apocalyptic literature. A lot of New Testament scholars will say we're actually learning more about like common themes from the times and places where the New Testament was written. And a lot of what we find in the New Testament fits the parameters of apocalyptic literature. And that makes some sense, they say. So by getting familiar with whatever is happening in apocalyptic literature, we can actually understand some of what's going on in the New Testament with a little bit more nuance. At its simplest level, she says, I'm at the bottom of page 2, she's going to define apocalyptic or apocalypse as the thought world that emerges amongst the Hebrew people after the exile, in which the human situation is seen as so tragic and insoluble that the only hope for deliverance is from outside this sphere altogether. It is the Hebrew people, the Jews, in such despair over what they've been promised, amidst such hope for deliverance, looking at a track record of abuse, oppression, and things not coming yet to fruition. They are stuck in exile. They're being ruled by foreign powers. And it's the sense that the only way that this is going to be made right is something totally removed from our situation. There's a sense in which there's like my agency is just not enough. It has to come from outside if this is going to actually be made right. And it has to come from outside because of how bad things are inside. So Rutledge likes this, as does the Apostle Paul, this kind of thinking, because it represents a sort of a cosmic standoff where God confronts and overcomes sin and death and suffering and evil. And it is very much like the death of your granddad, the death of your spouse, the death of your child, but it's death as such, like the possibilities of death. It's very much your sin, your own infidelities, your own lies, your own greed, but it's capital S sin, like the power and force of sin as a whole. It's very much your sufferings, right? The career didn't work out, you're lonely, it's not working, but it's the possibility of suffering altogether. It's such a big cosmic view of it that it's like collected suffering and sin in totality. And the cross is the moment that God addresses all of it, sin and death and suffering, in a like total and final way. And she thinks that within the schema of apocalypse, the New Testament's prioritization of God's justice confronts our notions of justice and righteousness being human possibilities. Meaning that justice is not a thing you and I can actually carry out. It's not as though if we're more strategic, I'm all about political organizing. I think we can like make some good work happen. But Rutledge thinks we deceive ourselves a little bit when we think if we just tinker with our systems enough, we can really get at justice and deliver it to all parties. Justice is not a thing, she says, that we're going to be capable of arranging for ourselves. And that same apocalyptic sense that has to come from outside of us. And she thinks that the Apostle Paul's like great originality was to frame the cross in terms of this kind of apocalyptic messianic venture, so that the triumph of God is hidden in the suffering of Jesus on the cross. She thinks that the Apostle Paul is reading the crucifixion in terms of apocalypse, so that it's not just one man's death by way of the Roman state. It's not just one God-man's death by way of the Roman state. It is that in a way that God is forever and definitively addressing the possibilities of sin and death. That's going to change the course of history to where everything after that is like on a recharted path towards the final abolition of those things. We have 5 minutes. I want to leave some time for prayer requests. So maybe we take 2 minutes for questions or clarifications or comments about this chapter. Do you like it? Do you not like it? Is it confusing? What do you think about the apocalyptic stuff?
My name is Josie. I want to ask, she talks about Paul equating the law as sin attaching to the law. If God gave Moses the law, why does he say that sin attaches to the law?
That's a great question. And your name was Dorothy, did I hear you correctly?
Dulcie,
Dulcie?
yes.
Great to meet you. The question was, how and why would Paul phrase sin in terms of the law when the law is given by God to Moses with the instruction for God's people to follow? It's a very good and complex question that I think I don't fully have the capacity to answer. I think whatever Paul means about the law being sin is much more about our perception of in relation to the law than the law itself. I think Christianity also has done a bad job in our 2,000-year history of trying to kind of turn away from, there's a pretty harsh disjunction between New Testament and Old Testament that comes up in conversation from time to time, as though, think about like the way that we talk about Pharisees and Sadducees, for example, that we can see some of our like anti-Jewish prejudice when we think of these religious leaders being inherently prideful, that their religious attempts are inherently offensive, when this is like the forms of religiosity that are downstream from what God's given God's people. And yet there's historical skews to where Paul can get comfortable saying the way we've undertaken this thing counts as a kind of a sin. That's more of me just trying to affirm your question and say it is confusing and loaded than to give you a real answer. But that's all I have for you.
Zach.
I have another question.
Okay, and then we've got one for the chat, and then we should do prayer requests. Take it away.
Why is the Genesis narrative not mentioned? Why does William Rutledge not mention the Genesis narrative where man believes the lie of Satan over the truth that God has told?
That's a good question of like, why is she not delving into the origin of sin and how is it even possible? I'm not sure. It might, I'll have to go back and check. It might come up later, but I think she's probably just trying to assume that we all know that it's here now. So let's focus on how the crucifixion addresses it rather than to wring our hands over where it comes from. But the possibilities of like how and why it happened in the first place there's a lot of interesting theology that happened there too. What was the question?
And so Shannon, when you were answering your first one, and Jesus gave us 2 laws. This is a statement. Shannon, right here.
Okay, that's good.
And then Kate and Jeff.
That's a good question, Kate and Jeff. The question is, does Rutledge talk at all about Jesus's acknowledgement or saying like at the point of death, forgive them for they know not what they do? I can't remember if she mentions it or not, but I think it would fit in plenty with the power of sin thing, and that there's a kind of willing, like we're ceding ourselves to the power of sin, the way that's clouding our thinking. There's a pretty rich tradition, I think, biblically and theologically of sin's cognitive effects, where almost like if we were to look at addictive sciences, right? There's a rewiring of your brain and physiology that happens because of your longstanding participation in this thing that's bad for you. Okay, let's pause here. We're actually out of time because I've managed poorly again, so I'm just going to pray on behalf of all of the prayer requests that I have neglected to take on your behalf. Does that seem fair to everybody? Okay, while I'm doing that, you can ask the Lord to forgive me. God, thank you for today, for the gift of this time and this space, for the chance to talk about important and interesting things with new friends and old friends alike. We ask that you would make us aware, give us the grace to become aware of the ways that you are already present to us. We thank you for the good news that you are no longer foreign to the concerns on our hearts and minds. For whichever of those are unarticulated in the room or even unknown to us, we ask that your will be done, and if you would make us comfortable with those things, that you would draw us to yourself and have mercy on us in all things. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, so next week we'll be back here at 9:15, and we'll do chapter 4 and 5. Thank you all.